Hi, my name is Miss Pebsworth, and I will be reading Chapter 3 of Finding Goby. Goby was happy. The sky was clear, the weather was warm, the ground was firm beneath her feet, and she and the man were running together. From time to time he would look over at her and smile. The warmth of that smile was even brighter than the sun beating down on them, but in a good way. It filled Goby up. Then she heard a strange rushing sound up ahead. What was that? Whatever it was getting closer. Dion heard it before he saw it. It was the rapid beat of running water. He could tell from the noise that this wasn't another creek. No, this was something a whole lot bigger and faster. Sure enough, as he topped the next rise, he spotted a broad expanse ahead. It was a river. Dion had no idea how deep it was, but the race markers led right across, so he had to assume he'd be able to make it across as well. With a sigh, he shifted his bag higher onto his back. All of his food was in there. If it had got wet, he'd be in real trouble. Fortunately, his clothes were made to dry quickly, and he had covers over his shoes that kept out pebbles and things, and also made them reasonably waterproof. That was all he could do. Taking a deep breath, he took a careful step into the water. It was surprisingly cold, considering how warm the day was, and he sank down up to his waist. But that was it. At least the riverbed seemed solid. He could make his way across. He just had to go slowly. One wrong step and he'd get completely wet. Plus, he could hurt himself since he couldn't see where he was putting his feet. This was going to take a while. Goby watched as the man plunged into the water. She wagged her tail, but he didn't look her way. He was clearly busy concentrating. She sat down just before the water and watched. Surely he would turn around and notice that she wasn't with him. But several minutes passed and he got farther and farther away. Finally, Goby couldn't take it any longer. She began anxiously running up and down the riverbank. Was the man going to leave her? At the sound of her bark, Dion stopped. He always made a point of facing forward, always forward during a race. There was no point in looking behind you, after all. It was just about what lay ahead. But this time he did glance back. Goby was sitting at the river's edge, barking and whining. It was the same thing she'd done at the creek the day before. She made it across that somehow, Dion told himself. She could do the same here. Except that wasn't the same. The creek had only been a few feet wide and not much deeper than his ankles. This was at least 100 feet across and waist deep on him. There was no way the little dog could cross that on her own, not unless she knew how to swim. And if she could swim, wouldn't she be doing that already? Not my problem, Dion told himself. He was here for the race. That was it. He hadn't asked for Goby to follow him. That was on her. But he'd fed her and given her water and named her. And he had to admit he liked having her with him. She lifted his spirits. And right now, listening to her whimper and whine as he left her behind nearly broke his heart. Oh, fine, Dion declared at last, turning carefully. He started to make his way back. The second she saw him turn around, Goby was on her feet, tail wagging furiously, her whimpers changing to happy barks. He was coming back. Goby was ecstatic. She barked with joy and even pranced in circles as she waited for the man to reach her. When he was close enough, Dion reached out one long arm and scooped Goby up off the ground. Then he hugged her to his chest. The little dog lifted her head and licked his cheek, which tickled. Dion laughed. Yeah, you're welcome, he told her. Now let's get going, okay? Just try not to squirm too much. This is going to be tough as it is. And it was. Before, Dion had kept his arms out for balance. Now, one of them was clutching Goby instead. That meant he had only one arm free. He had to go even more slowly and more carefully than before, and he still slipped a few times, though never enough to go completely underwater. Through it all, Goby was amazingly good. She didn't struggle at all. She didn't bark. She didn't whimper. She just snuggled up against his chest and watched as they slowly inched their way across the river. Once they'd reached the other side, Dion set her down. She quickly circled him, barking and wagging her tail. then she nipped at his shoes. Yeah, we're going, he agreed. He was tired from the river crossing, but he knew he couldn't stop now, especially not with Tommy already so far ahead. Remembering what Tommy had done earlier was enough to make Dion mad all over again. But this time, instead of frustrating him, that anger gave him strength. Let's go, he told Gobi. Let's see what we can do to cut down this lead. She barked once, and when he set off, she settled in beside him, matching his pace perfectly. Dion shook his head. He didn't know where she'd come from, but this little dog sure could run. The day was winding down, and the finish line should be visible from the top of the next hill. Dion and Gobi had kept up a steady pace since the river, and he was pleased with their progress. Once or twice he'd caught a few glimpses of two other runners up ahead. That had to be Tommy and Julian, because no one else had passed him, but the path had twisted enough that Dion hadn't been able to tell how far ahead they were. Now, as he reached the top of the hill, he looked and stared. What? He thought. There, past a series of small hills, was the finish line, with the tents past it. And there were Tommy and Julian, still only halfway there. How was that even possible? Dion had been sure the other two would have finished already, but they hadn't. In fact, they seemed to be walking. They must have used up too much energy getting across the river, which gave him an idea. Come on, Gobi, he told her. He hurried down the hill, then raced up the next one. But he slowed just before he reached the top and moved as carefully and quietly as he could. He was tall and thin and dressed all in yellow. If Tommy and Julian looked back, they'd definitely see him. So he sprinted when he was out of sight and moved quietly when he was visible at the top. And the other two runners didn't look back. The distance between them started to shrink. Dion ran down each hill and back up as fast as he could, then moved quietly across the top. Gobi somehow understood his intent because she didn't bark or yip at all. She was as silent as a ghost, though her tail wagged furiously. It was clear she thought this was the best game ever. Together they ran, and Tommy and Julian got closer and closer. But so did the finish line. Finally, Dion crested the last hill. He was no more than a few 100 feet behind the other two. This time he crept down the hill as well, and together he and Gobi snuck up on the other two, moving as fast as they dared. Amazingly, Tommy and Julian didn't look back. Were they that tired? Dion had a lot of practice running in the heat. He was from Australia originally, so he knew all about hot days. Maybe Tommy and Julian weren't as comfortable in the high temperatures. Whatever the reason, the gap between them kept shrinking. 100 feet, 80 feet, 60 feet, 40, 20. Dion's foot must have scuffed a rock, or maybe it was his shadow suddenly appearing near them, because Julian finally glanced back and saw him. Dion grinned. Too late. He put on a burst of speed. Gobi barked and sped up to match him. Together they sprinted past Julian, then past Tommy. Dion saw Tommy's eyes widen as they raced by. Tommy struggled to catch up, but staying out in front had worn him out. He just didn't have enough strength left to match Dion's sudden surge forward. Dion charged past. He crossed the finish line first, with Gobi right beside him. The volunteers all clapped and cheered. "That was amazing," one of them told him. "You're having a super race." Dion smiled and nodded. It was true. He'd come in third the first day and fourth the second, but today he'd come in first. That put him in really good shape. "I owe a lot of it to my little good luck charm here," he said, kneeling down to ruffle Gobi's fur. She barked and licked his face. "Isn't that right, Gobi?" When he straightened back up, though, Dion was all business. "Can I come by and talk to you later about what happened before the first checkpoint?" He asked the organizer. "I need to clear my head first." "Sure," she agreed. The organizers did take Dion seriously this time. It helped that the other runners also confirmed what had happened. In the end, they adjusted Tommy's time by 5 minutes. Dion thought it should have been more, but at least it was something. Besides, he had finished first today. That was something. Dion wondered if tomorrow Tommy would go for the win from the start of the race to make up for not winning today. Gobi didn't seem to mind any of it. She was just happy to eat some of his food, drink some water, and then curl up beside him and go to sleep. And Dion had to admit he was getting used to having her there. Thanks.